Welcome everybody. This is our last crisp talk presentation of the year. We have another, we usually do three or four of these a year. We have another one scheduled, I believe, on March 6th. You should be getting a notice, save the date kind of thing coming up after the holidays. So welcome everybody. And today we're pleased to have Dr. Marisa Marraccini, I said that right, to talk with us today, but I'm going to let Nicole do a more formal and elaborate introduction. So Nicole.
So I was really excited when Van offered me the chance to introduce Marisa because Marisa was the very first postdoc I ever got to mentor. And she has been so successful. Um, it made me sad when she left and went on interviews, and also when she also so happy for her. So she has been very successful at UNC Chapel Hill. She actually is the Donald and Justeen Tarbet Faculty Scholar in Education. She's already got multiple dozens of grants, including 13 Foundation, AFSP, NIMH. She's been, just really doing a great job in terms of juggling grantsmanship at the same time of teaching a ton of classes, mentoring a ton of dissertations. A number of folks have come into my group either as RAs or as postdocs because she just like pulls in all the good people want to work with her. So she's just such a joy. I'm so excited to get a chance to see her presentation today. And I will stop taking up your time. I put a link to some of her information in case you wanted to learn more in the chat. So go ahead, Marissa. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, let me just start sharing. And let's see if I can do this right. I have too many monitors up. What do you see? Do you see like a big...
It's presentation mode, so I think you have to flip it.
Okay. You know what? I'm just going to... and try this again. How's that? And actually, I have to do that one more time because I forgot to hit share audio. So bear with me. Okay. Looks good? Okay. Hello, everybody. This is such a pleasure to be able to present to so many people who have either been mentors or inspirations along the way and continue to be. It's been really, really neat over the last 8 years to be able to kind of launch this work following my postdoc. And then over the last year, I've had a chance to come back and work again more directly with Nicole and in her lab. And it just feels like a very lovely full circle moment. So I'm going to be talking about supporting kids during and following suicide-related crises, specifically thinking about school reentry and some of the innovative, which I think are innovative, some of these approaches that we recommend for supporting them during this transition. And before I start, I'll just tell you a little bit about who I am, since I know you probably don't know me. I was trained as a school psychologist. I got my PhD in school psychology at the University of Rhode Island prior to having the incredible opportunity to complete my postdoc at Brown. And when I was studying school psychology, I was really interested in supporting kids holistically across all sorts of areas. And it really wasn't until my internship year, when I was working in a school psychology role in Coventry, Rhode Island, with Coventry Public Schools, that I became very focused on suicide prevention. At that time, I was involved in all the activities that you might imagine a school psychologist might be involved in, namely cognitive assessments, among other things. But I was really lucky to have a mentor who gave me a lot of time, unstructured time, to just create informal relationships with kids. And looking back at that, I think a lot of those experiences have sort of informed the things that I care about for upstream suicide prevention. But among that, I was also involved in risk assessments and referrals for then just emergency department visits, because that was when I think mobile health crisis was a lot less accessible. I don't know how it is in Rhode Island now. And then also in helping kids when they were coming back to school after an inpatient experience. And, I've said this many times, and I think it's becoming less and less true over the years, which I'm excited to see. But at that time, we had pretty standardized protocols for conducting risk assessments. And yes, they're incredibly limited, and there's lots of work to do there. But at least as someone working in a school who needed protocols to figure out sort of the intersection of keeping kids safe and also liability issues, which are impossible to not pay attention to when you're in a school, we knew what to do in terms of assessing risk for suicide. Were they accurate? Probably not, but we had a pretty low threshold. We referred out. When kids were coming back after either an emergency department visit or an inpatient hospitalization, we had no template or no blueprint for what to do. And I had some firsthand experiences struggling with that. All the research that I've done since then has sort of validated some of these very anecdotal experiences that I had as a school psychology intern at that time. But even when I did everything that I could to try to get approval to communicate with different folks, outpatient therapists, inpatient providers, and the family was on board, I was left with no information about how to support these kids as they adjusted to the school setting. And that really motivated me in applying for the postdoc at Brown with Nicole. And there I was able to sort of see the other side of things, which were really fundamental for the work that I'm involved in, where when I was managing the BEAR study with Nicole, immersed in inpatient and had the opportunity to work with Tony Spirito and Jen Wolf, among others, as just a therapist on one of their RCTs. All of that really set the framing for this work. Since then, I've been at UNC first as an assistant professor, now as an associate professor, and I've had this incredible opportunity to connect with lots of humans who have helped make this research possible. Many of the folks on this screen are particularly important for what I'm going to talk about today. Some of them are current students, some of them are previous students, some of them are faculty in other places. And then before I start, just to acknowledge the kind of breadth of work that I'm presenting was funded by various foundations and NIMH, and that the content I'm presenting is solely my responsibility. I use artwork that was contributed largely by Lena Marraccini, who is my niece, who was a teen when she did most of these pieces of art. And some of it is mine, and you can tell the difference by the quality, because mine is far poorer quality than hers. I use illustrative quotes throughout this entire presentation. They are true statements made by either participants or partners in our projects, and when they are out loud, audio recorded, they're actors, teen actors for the teens, and adult friends for the adults. Okay, so I'm going to really briefly talk about why it's really important for us to think about this school reentry period. And then I'm going to talk about, for the most of this talk, I'm going to talk about what we can do to improve school reentry procedures as we support kids during and following a suicide-related crisis and think about school context. And then I'm just going to give a very brief overview of some of the virtual reality work that's come out of this that we are engaged in right now. This slide has all the facts that everybody knows. Suicide remains a leading cause of death for our kids. We know that high schoolers continue to report suicidal thoughts and behaviors at higher levels than we want. That 1 in 5 will report seriously considering attempting a suicide in a given year. 1 in 10 will report having attempted a suicide from the YRBS data that we have. And we've seen relatively a steady increase in help seeking for suicide-related crises prior to the pandemic, with a sharp increase during the pandemic, especially among our teen girls. And sort of putting all those stats to the side, for all of you who work with these individuals in these different settings, you know, or you talk to anybody, and Things are really hard right now in the emergency services for working with kids with suicide-related crises. Things have not eased up. I think it's really important, though, especially as a suicide prevention researcher, to constantly shift back to what does that look like for the kid who's going through these difficulties. And so I'm going to just start by sharing a quote from one of our participants, who I'll explain how we got them later, talking about the complex array of issues that they face and why they were really struggling. And of course, this is just one kid's perspective. I will say that this perspective represents a bucket of perspectives that many kids have, but not all kids.
It was kind of like people, like my therapist and that type of thing. They were like, oh, you should put yourself first. But it was not like you can't have both. It's like you can drop out of school, like you can put yourself first and you can choose to put yourself first over schoolwork. But then it'd be like, I'd have to drop out of the program. I could potentially fail all my classes or get incompletes for them.
I meant to ask, thumbs up, could you hear that? Okay, great. And so I think, over the years of doing both qualitative research and co-design research with teens, this theme has remained true. It's been really inspiring to see young folks be more proactive and vocal and open about their mental health difficulties. And at the same time, there's this duality in us being willing to hear them and not really removing some of the complex pressures that seem to be growing. And so this is a tension that we hear a lot from our kids that sort of helps illustrate some of these facts. So moving into why focusing on school reentry is important, none of this will be news to folks here, but despite being the de facto treatment for a suicide-related crisis, there really isn't a standard treatment administered across inpatient programs. Generally, we know that they tend to focus on safety and medication management, stabilization, preparation for discharge, but that looks incredibly different from hospital to hospital. I feel like I've been really lucky to have experiences both here at UNC and then also at Brown to be in settings that have really done high quality services and supports, but I know that is not the case everywhere. We also know that some inpatient units have hospital schools or some sort of representation of schooling, but many do not. And those that do have hospital schools usually have a liaison or a teacher or someone who's helping support communication between the school around not just getting academics, but also getting school context to inform case conceptualization, and also helping prepare kids to return to school specifically. So kids who are hospitalized for suicide-related crises are experiencing a range of different interventions and services that may or may not touch on school. And they're also, of course, coming from incredibly unique home and school community settings. And again, I'll say this over and over, their experiences are incredibly variable, from being eager to get back to school because that's their safe place, all the way to wanting to stay in the hospital because both home and school are very dangerous places for them, and every sort of variation in between. Here's one kid's description of their experience as to why they really didn't want to leave the hospital.
I didn't want to go back. I kind of wanted to stay in the ward as long as possible. I was just having intense dread about going back. I felt safer in the hospital, safer from my own behavior, safer from the outside world in general.
Okay. When kids do leave, some go back to school, some end up in residential treatment settings, some go to partial hospitalization programs, some weren't in school to begin with. There's a lot of variability. But we do know that most kids do eventually end up going back to school or were in school to begin with. So schools are a pretty important context to think about during discharge. We also know that individuals remain at heightened risk for a suicide attempt and a rehospitalization in that immediate period following discharge, when they're returning to schools that really may or may not be prepared to actually support them. We conducted a really formative study several years ago to try to understand the extent to which schools had formal protocols in place to support kids following psychiatric hospitalization. And we found that approximately 40% had something in place, and far more had nothing. I've seen that change over the years, but at least in 2019, that's where we were. We also know that it's a pressing issue. There's actually a growing body of literature that looks at youth, family, and care provider perspectives on this. And folks are really calling for attention to supporting kids as they return to schools. And in particular, we really want to break this cycle of if schools are a contributor as a stressor, or if they're a place that can be safe, that we can lean into and provide more supports, we want to make sure that we're attending to that to try to prevent that rehospitalization. But particularly if the school is a stressor, we can anticipate that there could be a cycle where kids experience stressors, are removed from those stressors, and then are put right back in the stressors without anything changing. And so here's one of our school professionals talking about that.
I think a lot of kids come back to school unequipped, and it's just the exact same. That's what sends them into the cycle again, is that they don't have anything. They can just fall back into the same patterns. Then they don't want to go back to the hospital because it was scary, and so they just try to stay under our radar instead of dealing. There's still a lot of follow-through, but I gather that it's not enough.
And so when kids are actually coming back into the school setting, some of them are welcomed and feel happy. Some of them are really overwhelmed and stressed. But no matter kind of which kid they are, it's an extreme shift in setting. Going from an inpatient experience where you don't have access to your technology, to your phone, where you have you get to stay in your pajamas all day, or something like that, where there's lots of stressors and disruptive things, but it's a very specific experience. Back into the school experience is jarring even for kids who are excited to go back. And so here's an example of one of our teens' perspectives on that.
On top of everything else going on and coming back, it was sensory overload. It was really hard. I understand that my parents wanted me to get back into school, get back into the rhythm of things, but what I had been through, I was definitely struggling staying there the whole day. I also had the pressure from my parents, and that was hard.
Okay, so right after I came to UNC, because of all of this, I was really fortunate to receive funding from American Foundation for Suicide Prevention to pursue the study that is the bulk of this presentation. But I do want to just acknowledge that I actually first wrote this as an R21 proposal when I was on postdoc with support from Nicole and also Kate Guthrie, and that really influenced sort of the scope of this work. I changed it a lot from that time that I wrote an R21 to this AFSP grant, but it's very cool for me to imagine sitting in Coro building and like workshopping a lot of this. So we had this little study where our aims were really to build guidance for hospitals and families and school professionals and schools around how to better support kids as they return to schools following a suicide-related crisis. Our study had three main aims. Our first was to better understand in North Carolina what school-based protocols existed. And this was to understand not what schools were already doing exactly per se, but to also understand what we could actually leverage when we make recommendations that they could employ with kids as they return to schools. So things that they might use to support any kid who's struggling with emotional difficulty, who may or may not have identified services already, so that we could start helping hospital providers and professionals and outpatient providers and professionals in understanding what's reasonable to recommend and expect from schools as they support kids coming back. Our second aim was to understand the key people in this experience's perspectives. And that included folks working in schools, folks working in hospitals, and teens who had been hospitalized for suicide-related crises, and their parents or care providers or legal guardians. And then our third aim was to synthesize the literature at large, as well as our findings from these first two aims, to begin to develop guidance and then present that back to these key players who are experiencing this and get their feedback to iteratively refine it. We were able to recruit 133 different high school professionals across the state of North Carolina who represented 27 different school districts to complete our initial survey. And then we conducted in-depth interviews with 19 teens and 19 of their parents, 19 school professionals, and 7 hospital professionals. And then we cycled back to 4 teens, 5 parents, and 7 professionals to refine the guidelines. And then since then, we've fully drafted them and we've sent them out to technical experts to get further refinements and updates. They've sent feedback back, and I'm really excited to share that we will be disseminating, after 8 years, these guidelines in full form in 2026. In the meantime, we have partnered with UNC to build this infographic that's freely available for folks who would like to have it. And it touches on some of the broader points that are in the guidelines. And I'm going to share with you some of the broader points that have made it into these guidelines. And then for those of you who would like papers, all of these guidelines are also informed by these papers that have come from this study. So I'm happy to share them at another time. I forgot to say, we present the guidelines in these kind of 3 different tiers. First, universal, what it is that schools and folks can be doing all the time in advance of a crisis, what it is that we can be doing to think about supporting kids' reentry during hospitalization, and then thinking about what happens immediately after hospitalization and beyond. So I'll start sharing a little bit about these universal considerations. And I'll first say that most of them are things that schools specifically are aspiring to as places that want to support the well-being of K through 12 kids. Some big ones are making sure that schools are really safe and positive and warm, and that we're creating this positive psychosocial climate. We know the literature is pretty clear that school connectedness and feeling safe and included in schools is a salient protective factor against suicide in general populations. And we're starting to see some evidence that it's even meaningful in kids before and after their hospitalization experience. So here's an example from one of our teens talking about how their reentry went smoothly because they had already had that connected relationship with their teachers.
Okay, I was really lucky because 2 of my teachers were really nice, and they were really involved, and they definitely didn't want me going behind because I feel like definitely if I wasn't a concentrated, hard-working student, they wouldn't have given me as much help.
And then we also know that school and family and community partnerships are just key, period. They're key for all situations, and they're really key for supporting kids with mental health difficulties. And this is not just because it can create a network for referrals and for broader supports and for making the school environment this interactive experience that's representative of their community. It's also because it breaks a lot of the barriers around information sharing. If we have instilled these partnerships at the beginning, the things I'll talk about later that can get in the way of communicating during reentry start to be removed. I've given a similar presentation like this to dozens of schools across the country, and one of the key things that schools who are really executing this well is that they have an established partnership with their emergency department and inpatient and hospital in their area. Where this gets really tricky and breaks down is in our more rural places where kids can go anywhere up to 2 hours in any direction. It's really hard to have those established relationships when kids are going really far away. But when there's an obvious sort of connection between a school and a hospital, having an annual meeting, for example, where the school is reminding the hospital what they're able to do and provide, and the hospital's reminding the school what they're able to do and provide, even for 20 minutes once a year, can be a game changer. Here's a school counselor talking about how much the partnerships with families really matter for reentry.
I think my most frustrating thing is, unless I already have a relationship with the student and the parent, I'm not necessarily going to know that they've gone to the hospital. That's incredibly frustrating.
So those 2 points are really key and can help all kids, not just kids as they're struggling. The last 2 points that I have in this bright pink rectangle are more specific to school reentry. And the first is to have really clear procedures around what it is that schools do when something like this happens, beyond risk assessments and referrals. And these procedures need to be overt, forward-facing, and accessible. It's incredibly important that members in the school know what to do when something like this happens. But it's also incredibly important that an outsider can go to a school's website and figure out who they need to contact should something like this happen. And this does a couple of things. It makes communication easier when kids are hospitalized for suicide-related crises. Families oftentimes are not thinking about school. It's not at the forefront of their brain. And so if there's any barrier to actually communicating, they're going to be less likely to reach out to the school. But the other piece is that it helps build that trust and those partnerships between families and the school and the medical and psychological community in the school, such that families tend to feel really isolated and alone during these experiences. We've heard that over and over from our parents. And it can seem like their kid is the first to go through something like this in a school. But if we have clear procedures that show that the school is equipped to do this, that they've handled it before, the families are a lot less likely to feel like this is a new and isolating experience, that this is something that the schools can actually handle and support them with. And then lastly, it's just incredibly important to continue to provide psychoeducation to our school members. This has to be ongoing and continuous. And with these kiddos in particular, a couple of things that are incredibly important are addressing some of the misconceptions about suicide-related risk, and specifically around what recovery looks like from a suicide-related crisis and what treatments and interventions are available in the community to support kids, so that schools don't expect kids to come back fixed after something like this, and fully recovered, and that they don't expect kids to look a certain way when they come back and still need supports and services. So a specific example of that I've witnessed is knowing that a kid can attend a football game and smile and laugh, and that's a great thing, but still require special supports and services to handle their recovery. That's something that's really hard for school professionals to understand sometimes, when it feels like they're bending over backwards to support kids and then they see them happy. So really leaning into helping understand that complexity. During hospitalization, I'm just going to talk about two different things that we've found in our research. The first is things that we can do to prepare for reentry, really concrete things that folks can do. And the second is to just review some of the facilitators and barriers to communication sharing during this time, and why or why not folks may want to share information. So, excuse me. Schools, if they are aware of a hospitalization, can do a number of things to prepare. They can offer gestures of support to the student and the family. The student and family may or may not take them up on it, but we've heard examples of situations where school professionals, this is rare, but school professionals have even gone to visit kids in the hospital. And those were talked about really positively. Some families talk about how they wouldn't want that, but that they wouldn't mind being asked. That may be unrealistic for many school professionals. So sometimes it's offering to send an email of care or send a letter in. Kids likely don't have access to email, but they do with their teachers in some hospital schools. So it can help open up feelings of connectedness and prepare them for that return. Schools should be proactively reaching out to families to begin to prepare for that reentry. They can gather data. If they have approval from the parents to communicate, they can start sharing information with the hospital and asking for any relevant information that's important for the reentry plan. In the hospital, it's also really important to start integrating school considerations throughout treatment. And this includes things like, understanding the specific stressors in the school environment, but also understanding the ways that kids present in schools. We know that kids' expression of symptoms can look really different in different settings, and so the school perspective is really important, and it's going to be different and oftentimes conflict with what parents say and also what is experienced in the hospital. And we really need to move towards a place of acceptance that doesn't mean that all of these things are wrong. Oftentimes we can get into these sort of like battles across settings where everyone feels like they're right and that the school is lying, for example, about the way a kid is presenting, or they're overplaying it or underplaying it. And oftentimes it's somewhere in the middle, and it looks different in these different contexts. So it's really important to, obviously hold everything with a grain of salt, but at the same time to authentically listen to what it is that schools are saying. Hospitals also have a opportunity to instill some psychoeducation to parents about how schools work. They're not expected to be experts, but oftentimes it's at this stage where families are first learning about something like a 504 plan or an IEP, and they may have never heard about that before. And so while it's not the job of hospitals to teach parents all about what that is, but they can instill some recommendations around here's why this diagnosis could lead to supports or accommodations in the school and why you might want to share this piece of information with the school. Across all of this, of course, we have to adhere to HIPAA and FERPA, and so it's really up to the family about if information is shared across entities, but these specific things can help facilitate the likelihood of information sharing in a more respectful and appropriate way. So why is it helpful to share information, and why should we be cautious about sharing information? There's some really obvious benefits to information sharing. So the first one is attendance. And so at a minimum, most kids, if they're pulled out of school for more than a certain amount of days, they're going to need a letter to document why that absence is excused. This doesn't even always happen, though. So here's a quote of one of our social workers talking about finding out about hospitalization in court.
I took a parent to court for attendance, and I found out in the courtroom that her son had been hospitalized. She didn't tell us. She told us in court. And so it was like, that would have been something that would have been excused. We would have wanted to know to support you, and we could have avoided this.
And you can hear the frustration in that. Like, everybody is frustrated in these moments. And of course, it's not any single person's fault. That parent is probably juggling a million things. But if we all sort of take the onus to try to help not make assumptions that people know how to navigate this, then we can help prevent issues like that. The other benefits I sort of already hinted at, many of the diagnoses that kids are receiving will open up the opportunity for services in the school, but not all of them. And so it's really important to be cautious about promising something like a 504 plan or an IEP, but it's also really important to try to share that it's possible. And the sooner we do it, the better, because it's a long process. And so if this child has never had a 504 plan, or they've never had an IEP, and they're receiving their first anxiety diagnosis, for example, the sooner we can get that information to the school so they can start to initiate the paperwork and the process, the better. It's also really impossible for schools to know everything. They're supporting hundreds to thousands of kids, our public schools are. And so if this information isn't shared in some shape or form, we're missing an opportunity to hold a reentry meeting. We're missing an opportunity to lean into informal supports that you might not need a 504 plan or an IEP plan for, but that the school wants to provide when they know that their kids are struggling. And we're missing an opportunity in best case scenarios for a continuity of care, which some of our kids want.
I want to continue that care and stuff. Maybe see if my counselors can be a support system to me, similar to the support that I'm receiving in the hospital.
So all of that being said, the cautions are real around information sharing, and no school is the same, and not all schools are going to be necessarily safe to share information with. And this is where these partnerships are really important. There's usually a point person or a liaison in the school that has a sense of how to hold information confidentially and who might be the right person to share information with within the school context. And if we can have a sense of that ahead of time, it's really going to help. But we've heard terrible experiences from families around the breaking confidentiality and not respecting privacy, where rumors are worsened, where teachers get information and share it with their kids, which I think I have a quote for. So things can happen, and it goes back to that psychoeducation and instilling these protocols in schools. But it's important to know that not all schools are alike, and we hope that most schools will follow the FERPA guidelines that they have to follow, but mistakes happen. So some of the concerns that our participants expressed were around the places that this information would go.
Just that if the hospital shares stuff about mental health, what's the school going to do with that information? Are they going to tell teachers? You don't know if that teacher is going to take it home and talk to their husband about it or their kid. Be like, oh yeah, this student's coming back, because you share with families, stuff like that. You don't know where that information is going to go. With schools, they're not like hospitals. They're not institutionalized. Like everybody's got this strict codes of conduct. Schools are a lot more loose, so you don't know where that information is going to go.
Whether that's accurate or not, that is sort of the sentiment that a lot of folks feel. And there is this sort of divide in how people talk about medical settings versus schools in terms of being able to hold information confidential. And I think although both are flawed in terms of, if you've ever been in the elevator, you hear people talking about things that they shouldn't be talking about. Like, both make mistakes. The difference is that in schools, this is their community setting. This is where they live and they grow. And so they get held accountable in a pretty high fashion in that informal way. In addition, and this is really a point that I think is worth focusing on when we think about information sharing, is there's a lot of hesitancy around, like, what's the point of sharing this information? So is there a reason that we need to share this information? And here's one teen describing that.
If the information had no purpose or benefit, like, if it didn't have anything to do with, like, the situation going on, it shouldn't be shared.
So I'll talk about this in the next slide, but we've really moved away from talking about should we share information or not, towards what information should we share and why. And really, truly, there isn't a need or a need to share a full discharge summary necessarily if there's information in there that the family's uncomfortable with sharing with the school. But there might be specific points that can be really helpful. And having conversations around why information and how information can be used is sort of the next step in this work. I do also just want to mention that stigma remains an incredible barrier to information sharing. And when we talk to folks about it, everyone sort of points at everyone else. And so my takeaway from that is that stigma is embedded in every setting and in every situation. And so we can point the fingers at others, but it is in the fabric, unfortunately, of our society, and it continues to be something that folks really struggle with. So this slide talks a little bit about the types of information that we might consider sharing across entities, and why or why not we might want to share that information. So, for example, kids and families were really hesitant when we talked about specific information to share reasons for hospitalization. That felt very private. Instead, they felt very favorable about sharing general information about kids who struggle with issues like they do, as opposed to personalized information about what led up to their specific hospitalization. And at the end of the day, if the school is able to know that this kid is struggling with suicidal thoughts and their recent hospitalization had no relatedness to the school, there may not be a reason to really push for that to be a piece of information that we share. On the other hand, if there are significant stressors in the school environment that are contributing to this student's depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, suicidal thoughts and behaviors more generally, the school can't really do anything about it if they don't know about it. And so that's really the way that we look at all of this information. I'll particularly focus on recommendations to school, and just making sure that when we make recommendations to school, that we're making them in a way that's not promising things to families that we may not be able to provide, because schools, public schools in particular, have a lot of processes and procedures that they have to go to. And even if they really want to provide a one-on-one support for a kid because of their needs, resource-wise and legally, they can't do so until they follow all of the procedures and processes. So we do want to be really careful in the way that we make those recommendations, so we're not pitting the family against the schools. And then the other thing I will say is that it's really important for schools to have a sense of what kinds of coping strategies that are applicable to school settings can be used, and that we pay attention to the limitations of those coping strategies in school settings. And if we get to it, I can talk a little bit more about that in the context of safety planning. Okay. So following hospitalization, we recommend that everyone take a student-centered, strengths-based, and trauma-informed approach. Student-centered because we tend to forget the student is the center of everything that we're doing. And we have meetings and we talk about kids without even talking to them. And so it's just incredibly important that everything is anchored around that kid. And that looks different for different kids. Strengths-based because we have a tendency to focus only on the problems. And this can make kids feel really small. And so everything that we recommend in our reentry process always starts with an acknowledgement of student strengths and what they bring to the table, which at a minimum in schools is showing back up in the school. And then trauma-informed because we know that kids who are hospitalized for suicide-related crises have a higher prevalence of traumatic experiences to begin with. And even if they do not, they're experiencing a really difficult thing right now. And so this is where trauma informed, and I'm so happy that it's grown in appreciation in the school context, really matters for kids like this. And then I'll talk a little bit about the reentry plan. I'm going to skip some of these because I want to make sure I get to the VR work. But we just have a bunch of quotes talking about all the different ways kids experience school reentry and all the strengths that they draw on, which are amazing. Okay. During the reentry process, it's incredibly important that schools establish a reentry plan, hold a reentry meeting, and do it as soon as possible. The sooner the better. That being said, it's never too late. So sometimes schools don't know that a child has had a suicide-related crisis, and even if they find out about it months later, they should hold a reentry meeting and a reentry plan at that point. It's important that it involves collaboration with key community members, but that the meeting itself is not overwhelming and filled with dozens of people. And it's really important that it provides structure for the student and the family. So this means balancing open-ended, reflective listening approaches with a menu of options to provide supports for families. One of the biggest mistakes that I've heard is that schools will very well-meaningly offer supports and ask families what they need without giving them specific options. And that can be really frustrating and overwhelming to the family who is not the expert of how schools work. And so it's really critical that there is some structure to these supports. The individuals who are involved are going to depend on that student, that family, and that school. Usually the involvement from the hospital is simply a letter or some sort of documentation that can provide recommendations. It is incredibly unusual from someone from inpatient to have time to follow up and be a part of this process, although sometimes that's what schools really wish could happen. We hope that it involves the outpatient or community therapist or provider that hopefully this kid is working with, although I know that that is oftentimes not a person who exists for many of these kids who the schools are really struggling to support, because although during discharge it's expected that they will see folks, by the time they're back in schools they oftentimes don't have anything in place. But sometimes they do, and so it's really important when they do to include those folks. At a minimum, it should involve the student, the family, a point person, and a trusted adult in the school. That doesn't mean that all of those people have to be at the meeting, but it means all of those people have to be represented in the plan. And the trusted adult is really key. So finding out from the family who in the school they trust, and if they don't trust anyone in the school, then that's our first point of intervention, figuring out how we can help that family find someone in the building that they trust. This does not have to be a student support staff. It doesn't have to be someone with mental health training. They're not going to be the person who's overseeing the plan. This is just someone that they feel connected to. This is a little bit about what we recommend is included in a reentry plan. I mentioned that it always focuses on student strengths, but of course also their areas of need. It really needs to explicitly address school-related stressors. We need to start with a clean slate with these kids and not assume that we know what their stressors are in school at this point, because oftentimes this will be the first time that they're mentioning a bullying experience or a victimization experience that the school wasn't aware of before. And it needs to spell out the specific school supports, accommodations, and interventions that are going to be used and implemented, and who's going to be responsible for them, and a plan for accountability. So at what point are we reconvening to assess if this is working or if it needs to be modified or if we can discontinue it? Ideally, it involves working together and drawing from the family's existing safety plan. But I want to make a note that when we work with schools around safety plan, the language is a little different. And so sometimes schools will say, yes, we have a safety plan in place. And what they mean is they have a larger safety plan for handling safety issues in the school. They don't mean the classic kind of Stanley and Brown safety planning intervention. And so when we work with schools from the outside to share safety plans and to make sure that they're adapted to the school setting, we want to make sure that they understand what we're talking about. And many do. And it's really important that safety plan has accounted for what needs to change or be different or how it needs to look in the school setting. This is best practice for safety planning to begin with. However, the vast majority of safety planning interventions that I've seen across at least the state of North Carolina are not collaborative safety plans done as best practice. They are checkbox, kids filling out on their own. Families don't even know what they mean in many cases. So, ideally in the inpatient and community settings, we're engaging a little bit more in depth with best practice safety planning. But if that's not happening, schools also have the opportunity then to help draw from some of the key components of the safety plan that they can use in the school. I cannot overemphasize enough how important it is that the safety plan is realistic for the school environment. We had one kid share a story about how they had a safety plan that was established during their reentry planning that everyone agreed to, and when they used a coping strategy in class, the teacher shamed them for using the coping strategy. That coping strategy was out the door forever for that kid after that moment. And it's terrible that that happened, but the takeaway here is that we cannot assume necessarily that coping strategies that we think are reasonable as mental health professionals will be respected and appropriate in a classroom setting. And so sometimes that means it needs to be specific to every single different part of the school day. And understanding, again, when we go back to information sharing and who's allowed to know what, that it's not always appropriate for many people in the school to know the exact context as to why we want to allow this kind of coping strategy to be employed by a kid. So the teacher who shamed that kid probably was purposefully withheld from information around what was going on, and at the same time then it worsened things. So it's very complex when you put all of those pieces together to think about who can know what to protect confidentiality and privacy, and also where can this kid actually use things that are going to be accepted. And then finally, in talking to all of these kids and families, the piece that gets lost almost always is following up with this kid after that initial reentry plan. Schools have made great gains in establishing reentry plans at the beginning, but they're strapped for time, under-resourced, pulled into the next crisis, and they oftentimes don't come back until this kid has another crisis. And that's incredibly problematic. Kids spoke to feeling like they were only taken seriously when they were expressing suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And then the minute they reach out to counselors for something a little bit lower risk, they're just shuffled right back into the classroom. And this is really tricky because we need kids to be in classrooms, and we have to have a thought process around making sure that we're really encouraging kids to build up their skills to be able to stay in the classroom. We don't want them to just leave the classroom every time something gets hard or stressful, but at the same time make sure that we're meeting them where they are and we're showing them that we care about them even when they're not in crisis. And we're working on how to make that happen. So before I shift briefly to our virtual reality work, I just want to end this with one quote from one of our teens who just gives a recommendation to everybody around how we support and treat kids after a hospitalization.
Just be on the lookout for them, because they're probably still a little bit hazardous. No one's going to completely get better the first time they go to the hospital. Asking them maybe on a daily basis, how was your day? How do you feel? Just low-key questions that can kind of tell you a lot about them. Maybe let them know that you're a support if you want to be a support. Some people don't want to. Explicitly let them know. Just be like, hey, I'm here for you if you ever need anything, if you need to talk or a shoulder to cry on. I feel like that's really important to a lot of people, because a lot of people feel really alone because they don't get that.
Awesome. Do I want to try to leave time for questions? I should have asked that at first.
You could look up at some questions in the chat, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you can, or if you can't, it's up to you.
I'm gonna do that.
People can stay a little bit longer if they want to ask questions. If you have time.
Okay. Yeah, I do. I have a question. So I'll give you like a 5-minute spiel about this work that we've done then, so that we can have some questions before and some questions after. So throughout all this process, while we were building these guidelines, I became really interested in what we can do during hospitalization to enhance the hospitalization experience and also better prepare kids to return to schools. And thinking about it more from a lens of how can we marry those two? And we learned while we were doing this work that oftentimes, especially hospital school teachers, do role playing with kids about their return to school as a way to help to prepare them. Thinking about what are they going to say when kids ask them where they've been? What are the other stressors that they're anticipating when they come back to school that they can practice in advance? And that in combination with just really observing and also, knowing firsthand and also seeing in the literature that there are just not a lot of opportunities for psychosocial interventions during a hospitalization stay. There are in some places. Like, I continue to reflect back on how wonderful Bradley was in terms of the availability of social workers and psychologists delivering interventions. That is so unusual in my experience. And I wanted to think about how we could give kids more access to psychosocial interventions during hospitalization and also help prepare them for their school return. And so I miraculously somehow got a K from NIMH to do this study, and was also observing and learning much more about virtual reality as a potential tool, and reading about virtual reality exposure therapy and how amazing it was for having comparable effects to in vivo exposure therapy, and decided that it would be a great idea to build a virtual reality intervention that could be delivered by frontline workers in inpatient settings that would supplement any psychosocial interventions that they were receiving, which in my head at the time, at a minimum, was a skills packet of CBT skills that they might get at the start of their stay, which I have seen to be true in a lot of different settings. And the idea was that they could work with their social worker or their psychologist or their therapist or whoever it was. Initially, this was the idea, to learn the skills that they were learning, and then they could have these practice experiences in VR to use them. And we had all this data at this time around what was hard for kids about returning to school. So we built vignettes that are in virtual reality that mimic what it's like to go back to school so that kids could practice these skills. When we started building this, actually I'll jump to this. Here's the papers that I can share later that support a lot of what I'm sharing. We picked 3 target skills. We picked affect regulation, problem solving, and cognitive restructuring as ones that we thought would be good to practice in a VR vignette. And then, actually I'm gonna come back to this. Our first phase of the study was to refine our conceptual model. And we interviewed teens, school professionals, hospital professionals to just make sure that this was a good idea and also right size it and think about what was really important to include in the vignettes and also important to include for the specific skills we were tackling, all of the above. And it was at this point that we realized that we had to teach the skills in VR. We couldn't just have these supplemental activities and assume that there would be someone there in the hospital to teach them the skills first. So we sort of went back and reformed our idea, and our VR experience became a virtual avatar coach who's teaching the kids skills, and then a second session where then they go into this immersive experience. They interact with teens who are not very nice. It heightens, and then they practice whatever the skill is that they just learned. So the way it's structured is that our avatar, our coach, first teaches them the skill, and then in the middle of it, they meet back up and they do a briefer version of the skill. So for affect regulation, it's kind of the easiest to explain. They learn affect regulation. They learn how to identify big emotions and handle them and practice using different relaxation strategies. And then in this scenario, in the middle of it, they identify what emotions they were experiencing and they move through the steps with this specific experience. We had to build it in a way, though, that kids could identify if they were actually distressed, because a lot of times the kids just think the scenario is funny. And it has still been really effective in that way, in getting a little bit of distress. And then they can also imagine a different time if they prefer to practice the skill instead of in this exact scenario. The scenarios we had, initially we built 3. And the way that they work is they're immersive, so they're like you can turn around and see the whole room, but they're pretty bare bones still. There's a couple peers, there's a teacher, and it's dialogue based, so it's kind of like a choose your own adventure, and the reactions of the characters change based on how you interact with them. We have an example of how you might have to select from different response options, but you do verbally say it back to them. So in this case, if I was asking them to leave me alone, I'd be like, leave me alone. And then it would respond accordingly. There is no golden path to these scenarios, so I don't know if those of you work in video games, but when we were building this, we just kept getting pushback from folks around, well, what's the right way to do this scenario? This scenario is a sandbox. There's no way to do it right. No matter what, kids are going to be mean. They're going to be less mean if you answer a little bit more politely. But the idea was that kids are telling us this happens, even if they're polite and perfect. And then it culminates in a safety plan. After every scenario, we review what are some new stressors that you identified, what are some of the coping strategies that you liked using, so that we can enhance what they're actually going to use in schools. Boy, I didn't do a 5-minute version. So really briefly, we did the conceptual model in our first phase. Then we did a lot of development and testing. We started with the just like ink files, which were choose your own adventure, and like going back and forth and building the dialogue and getting teens to say out loud what they think would be said. Then we put it into a computerized version, tested it that way. Then eventually we got it into VR. It was incredibly boring at first, especially like teaching the skills, because we just didn't have the budget to make it interesting. So we ended up using a free animation software to get creative. And my voice is like layered throughout so much of this, where the kids in the headset go back and forth from talking with the coach to watching little animated videos inside. And there's nothing novel about the skill lessons themselves. And there's no reason that they need to be in VR, except that it makes it a packageable thing altogether. And it removes some of the barriers to getting these kids access to these skills. Then we did a pilot optimization trial into inpatient settings in North Carolina. We also did a really small pilot open trial with clinicians and teens to get feedback around what we would need to do to make this actually usable by clinicians. And it was a pilot trial, so we focused on feasibility and acceptability. And in general, you know, we tested this with we recruited 42 kids, and because it was an optimization trial, 44 kids, 39 of them received some component of the intervention. And they were incredibly diverse, as we would expect. They reflected the inpatient population that we work with here in North Carolina. And in general, we really found the things that we were hoping to find. We found that there was just only minimal distress during the VR in a way that we hoped would happen. Perhaps it could have been a little bit more stressful, but beyond that, it was relatively safe. Kids didn't express too many safety concerns. There was some cyber sickness, which we've since addressed in an improved quality, but related to the graphics, not related to anything that they were doing. And for the most part, kids found it to either be minimally acceptable or really a nice addition to their inpatient stay. Some kids hated it, as kids hate things. Sometimes those are my favorite kids. So this isn't perfect for everybody, although some of the kids who hated it, I think probably still got some things out of it. And a lot of the kids recommended that they thought other kids could benefit from it. So we got kind of the pilot data that says, like, there's something here that we should try. Do we know if it's effective? Absolutely not. I'm going to skip that. But we also got feedback for improvement. And so during this time when I was pilot testing it, I sought out funding from MQ Mental Health because kids were saying that they really wanted it to be more personalized to their experiences. So we're in our 3rd year of this study. I'm really rushing through it, sorry. But we have co-designed additional vignettes with kids who identify as LGBTQ+ or ethnic or racial minoritized and have recently been either in the ED or hospitalized for a suicide-related crisis. And we're currently running a pilot clinical trial of these new scenarios. They're really cool. I'm like really excited about this study. The first year of this study was just building safety protocols to safely co-design with teens, with young teens, with 13 to 16-year-olds primarily, with suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And so we have a paper that is in press right now that describes our safety protocols and teen perspectives on that. And was really nitty-gritty work. Really cool, though, to be meeting weekly or bi-weekly with teens who are all recovering from a suicide-related crisis and getting them to come together and roll up their sleeves to some extent, some of them more than others, to build these scenarios. To come, we're going to keep exploring their potential. I just want to close with one of our teens' experiences in co-designing around how important it is for us to just remember that these kids need safe places to continue to talk about their recovery. The co-design experiences in particular were really illuminating for the way that we tend to fragilize kids with suicidal thoughts and behaviors and sort of exclude them because of that from opportunities like this. And I'm landing with this quote because it has become my passion and my heart at this point to make sure that their voices are as centered as every other kid's voices.
In kids who have been hospitalized for stuff like suicide, I think it's really important to talk about this stuff. A kid at my school
Sorry.
The day after Christmas, he killed himself. So my school just lost a junior and nobody has talked about it.
And that was during our co-design sessions. Like, this is a kid who had suicidality herself and was like, I just lost someone and I have no one at school to talk about. Okay, thank you all so much. Really appreciate the opportunity. I'm happy to stay on. Sorry, I went a couple minutes over.
Thank you, Marissa. That was a great talk. So, you know, if Marissa can stick around for a couple minutes and answer a few questions. I know some people may need to leave, but people have questions or comments. Go ahead.
I love seeing all the names pop in of people that I know.
I had a question. Thank you so much for this incredible talk and what amazing work you're doing. I had a question about virtual reality as a medium for the intervention. Just kind of an overall question. How did you find it? Was it well received overall? Did you find that teens jived well with that medium? Were they excited about it overall, or is that kind of like a future direction in your opinion? Or what are the thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. So, um, it's interesting from like when I was presenting to different science reviewers about this, like oftentimes the question is, does it need to be virtual reality in terms of like, could we do this on a computer and it be just as effective? So that remains empirically unknown to me. And I did study a lot of like intelligent use of technology in the context of my K and have done a lot of research and thinking about it. And I do think in the vast majority of cases, computerized interventions are probably just as effective and sometimes more effective than VR. I don't think that's going to be true in the case of this intervention for a couple of reasons, but I don't know this to be true. This is based on being under budgeted and being one of the key deliverers of this intervention, which I know is like problematic, but it is what it is. One is that yes, kids really jived, to use your words, with with VR. It was one of the most fun studies to recruit for because we were not just offering an intervention, but we were offering kids the opportunity to put on a headset while they're in the hospital. And so I think there is something to just the novelty of the technology itself outside of my like intervention ideas that is worth separating out and considering. And in particular, anecdotally, for boys. Several of the boys in our study who I worked with were not really talkative, didn't really seem interested in really anything. And the way it works is we kind of give a preview of the skills before they put the headset on. And so, you can imagine doing the preview of the skills. They're not saying anything. They're just like, or if at all, we're getting a grunt. They put the headset on and they're willing to talk to the avatar. And then they take the headset off and they're willing to talk to me. So I really do see it for some kids, not all. And there's motion sickness issues and some kids hated it. Like there was one kid in particular who was really stressed by the avatars, just found the uncanny valley issue to be incredibly problematic and was freaking out, and we just took the headset off and we moved on. But for some kids in particular, I think it's a modality that's worth considering. And I think it's like anything else, it's not perfect for everyone, but it could be really helpful for some.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Other questions for Marissa?
Hey, Marissa. Yeah, thanks for the talk. It's very interesting. How much do VR sets cost? I know nothing.
Yeah,
Are they
yeah.
very expensive?
No.
Oh,
Like a high quality basic one is like $200.
okay.
Yeah.
One reason I ask, I'm a consultant on the screening in pediatrics grant, and they're having trouble recruiting because the pediatricians were supposed to do the screening. Gave them all iPads. And the major problem with recruitments is the iPad wasn't charged. They lost the iPad, that kind of thing, so it's a great idea. Like and this is part of your implementation, I'm sure, with the how do you get these hospitals to buy these things? not lose them, keep them there and use them with the kids once they get going. It might be no problem because everybody thinks it's cool, like you said. And so that the kids really want to do it. So you have a little advantage, but there's always that last, you've done all this work, and it'd be ironic that that would be the holdout for more broad implementation. So it is something to think about.
I think, I mean, I think that's our biggest issue, to be honest. I'm on the same page as you. When we did the open trial and had clinicians deliver it, it wasn't just like keeping the device and charging it. It was like a brave new world for these folks. Like they have never really done VR. So, you know, I initially had hoped to move to a fully powered RCT with this work, and I've very humbly backed up and am thinking about maybe pursuing an R21 to think about really focusing specifically on what we would need to do to make this feasible for the frontline workers in a hospital to use. I think the one thing we have going for us in the inpatient setting is that there is a precedent for having VR headsets there already. Like some of our recreational therapists and occupational therapists have used them. And so I think there's like this intersection between a kid's readiness and interest and a clinician's readiness and interest, and then what we need to do to scaffold all of that together. So I agree. It's a huge barrier.
Well, it's very interesting. It's great if you can keep pursuing this line.
Yeah, I hope I can. We'll, we'll see. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Marissa. Again, a great talk, and keep up the good work. It seems like there's certainly a need for that kind of thing.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity. I know I said this already, but really cool to be presenting to you all. Really neat for me.
Great. Thanks so much.